The first session will take 1 hour from 6:30 to 7:30 roughly. It will be delivered by Dr. Anna Lefteratou. This is the regular format, as it were. We employ it for every conversation day. After Anna's delivery, we will have a brief response from Alon, the other speaker for the day. I'll say a few words about both speakers in a second. And then we'll have 10 minutes for questions from the participants. Then again, we'll have a short break and continue from 7:45 up until 8:45. These are all UK times, so they may be a bit confusing for those of you who are on a different continent. And again, there will be a response to Alon from Anna and 10 minutes for questions from the audience. Now, I'll say very briefly a few words about our speakers today, who are both newly appointed research associates of the Institute. Dr. Anna Lefteratou, our first presenter today, with whom some of you may already be familiar, as she delivered a fascinating series of seminars on miracles, which ended earlier this month, actually. She's a trained classicist. She holds a BA from Athens, a DEA from Paris Sorbonne, and a DPhil from Oxford University. She held 2 research positions at the University of Göttingen and Heidelberg before moving to the UK. Her research focuses on the reception of classical literature in imperial prose and late antique verse, and in particular on the early Christian reception of the classical world. She is the author of Mythological Narratives, the bold and faithful heroines of the Greek novels, in 2017, and is currently finalizing her second monograph on the biblical poem, the Homeric Centos of the Empress Eudocia. Apologies for any deficient pronunciation. Dr. Alon Segev, our second speaker, is the author of 3 books and numerous essays and articles on various topics in religion, intellectual history, and philosophy in antiquity and modernity. He's been Minerva Fellow at Heidelberg University, where he gave seminars in philosophy. He had the DFG grant at Cologne University, where he also gave seminars in Jewish philosophy and Holocaust studies, and assisted in editing Maimonides' medical writings. He's been visiting scholar at Oxford, Innsbruck University, Stellenbosch University, and Ruhr University, Bochum. He currently teaches at Loyola University Chicago. His research interests include the canonical status of the Old Testament and the New Testament, from Marcion to modernity, religion and tolerance, interfaith dialogue, indeed the theme of today's conversation day, symbols and icons in Christian and Jewish scriptures. As I have mentioned already, the first speaker for today will be Dr. Anna Lefteratou. So I will not extend this prologue any longer. Anna, you have the virtual floor.
Many thanks for this lovely introduction, and you pronounced everything great, all the Greek and all the Latin there. It was magnificent. I have a PowerPoint presentation that I will shortly share with you on my screen, as I always do. I have also brought some text, which I'm going to read during my presentation, which are our sources to think with about interfaith dialogue or otherwise. When we were thinking the topic together with my co-presenter, Alon, we found that it was very difficult to talk only about interfaith dialogue. There was also resistance, and there have also been positive aspects. There have also been very negative sides, aspects from antiquity to modernity. So parts of both of the presentation will highlight exactly this way of how big cities encourage both dialogue and also opposition, and also reaction and sometimes even intercommunal violence based on religious issues. I will present late Antique Alexandria, and I will start sharing my PowerPoint with you. Well, sharing, should be able to do that now. Here, I hope you can all see it by now. Is it fine? Then I can make it small. Excellent. So just to start not with Alexandria on the delta of the Nile in the North Africa, but let's start somewhere else. In the Acts of the Apostle in chapter 17, 16 to 19, the Apostle Paul arrives to Athens. And there he walks through the city, he talks in the synagogue, both with Jews and with God-fearing Greeks, as we learn. And he even discusses with a group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. It is in this context, he even makes it to the marketplace where he discusses with other human beings. When in this context, he arrives on the Areopagus, the small hill opposite the Acropolis, where he delivers his famous speech to the unknown God, where he invites the Athenians to convert to the unknown God, and he talks to them for the first time about the resurrection. When Paul arrives to Athens, what he does so in his double identity, both as a Jew, also as a Roman citizen, as we know he has been, but also as one who is participating in the Greco-Roman educational system. Because when he was posing on the top of Areopagus, he was more or less imitating the philosophers and the orators of his times who were doing exactly the same. They were going up the Pnica and they were discussing with each other, also arguing with each other. This shows exactly the kind of multi-layered and multicultural environment that was in Athens in the 3rd century AD when Paul visited. And exactly reflects his own observation that indeed Athens was cathedral, full of idols, full of temples, for every possible kind of divinity that existed in the Mediterranean world. This image of Athens and Paul, I want now to transpose it and to transfer it onto late Antique Alexandria. Alexandria was founded, as her name of the city means, by Alexander the Great. And it was founded in order to be a metropolis and in order to be a city with civilizations and religions fused. It was founded so by Alexander the Great in 332 BC. And from its beginning, it was supposed not to oppose the Egyptian religion, which was replaced by the Greek religion, but to provide some kind of syncretism, some kind of osmosis between the two. There was a big famous port. I mean, after all, Alexandria was the port from which wheat made it all the way up to Europe through the Roman Empire, also later the Byzantine Empire. It was extremely important strategic location. This is how they were producing their own wheat. And what it is interesting to observe is that when Alexander the Great founded the city and he took upon himself the crown of the pharaoh, and he presented himself as a reincarnation of Amun-Ra, he also organized a sports game of the kind of the Greek games, like Olympic games, gymnastic games, and he tried to bring the two civilizations together. This was his plan for all his empire. One of the most famous divinities of Alexandria, which started with Alexander, with the Heirs of Alexandria, then continued all the way in late antiquity, was the divinity Serapis. It was a god of resurrection, of rebirth, and of abundance. It came from the Egyptian god Apis, in a combination with qualities from Osiris, the god of the underworld. This is how it might have been the Egyptian representations, and this is how the Hellenistic monarchs after Alexander in the 2nd, the 3rd century BC depicted him, with Greek characteristics, as they did not believe in anthropomorphic gods. The reason I'm saying that is just to show the kind of way of how Alexandria was meant to be a place of osmosis, a place of collaboration, a place of dialogue. The famous ruins that you see here are the ruins of the big temple, which was erected to honor Serapis, exactly this divinity that the Hellenistic rulers and later also the Roman rulers worshipped. The famous Serapeum, now you can see some stones there, which besides being a temple for a specific divinity, was also a famous library. So it was a meeting point, it was a place where papyri were collected, it was a place where discussions were held. Most of you would have heard about the famous Library of Alexandria. The Library of Alexandria, you can see here an imaginary representation on the left. blossomed especially before Christ, and probably was burned down during the fights with Julius Caesar in Egypt, during the fights of this war. Part of it was restored. Some of these manuscripts were removed to safety. Part of them were moved into the Serapeum that I just discussed above. And what was important, though, is that in Egypt and in Alexandria, what has been excavated from late antiquity, meaning the period after Constantine the Great, all the way to the 6th century, is this kind of auditoria. These are rooms for seminars. It's a seminar room, not a virtual like we are today on Zoom, but real ones where people could sit and discuss together. You can imagine somebody coming down from the stairs here, giving a speech, presenting his views, and people from the bottom have tons of oppositions or maybe agree with him. It have also functioned, these kind of rooms, as schools, especially for the elites who were supposed to become trained orators, because this is how we would get a job back in these days, by training and honing your philosophical and speaking rhetorical skills. And this is the cultural milieu, and this is what I meant by Paul in Athens presenting as a kind of orator, where both Christians and pagans and Jews would have been trained. So to some extent, Alexandria provided facilities to become a good citizen of the Roman Empire, irrespective of one's religious background. But the situation was not always easy. So there have been many events in the story of Alexandria from the 1st century all the way down to the 3rd and 4th century, where I want to discuss a bit more in detail later during my presentation. But actually, when this kind of harmonious coexistence of different people with different religions did not always work out. We know that after Alexander the Great, the Jewish population, for example, of Alexandria was up to 500, like 1/3 of 35% of the city were Jews. They had lots of privileges. Then they were allowed to observe the Sabbath the way they wanted it, so they did not have to work on Sabbath, and they did not have to join military service, also later. But of course, all these edicts that they were giving some freedoms eventually became other edicts which were restricting the freedoms, as we will discuss later. The first centuries, especially the early centuries before Christ, it was exactly the time where the Jewry in Alexandria blossomed, and the osmosis with the Greek intellectual life produced some of the most magnificent works of interfaith collaboration. I'm speaking, of course, about the translation of the Septuagint from Hebrew into Greek, because the Jews who were in Alexandria and who were fluent in Greek, they wished to have this work translated into Greek. So they sat down and then translated the full Old Testament into the modern Greek of that time. Another eminent Jewish personality, a very strong philosopher, was Philo, who was born in Alexandria. He was educated in Platonic philosophy, and he tried to communicate his Jewish cultural background with the Greeks in a language that the Greeks, in philosophical language, in a rhetorical language that they understood. The impact of Philo was enormous, and we will see it also later, also in church fathers, Christian church fathers of the 4th and the 5th century, although they not always highlighted their depth to him. So normally we find allusions which are hidden, but we are probably certain that they did read him. Several events, of course, just disturbed the harmonious coexistence of people together. So every now and then, intercommunal revolts and violence occurred between the different populations in Alexandria. So in 38 AD, there was the Greeks desecrated the synagogues. Then, at some point, there has been a massive Jewish revolt across Egypt and across the Mediterranean world, about which Alon also is going to talk today, and which was crushed by the Roman army. This has been a very heavy blow to the Jewish population of Alexandria, which it was almost at the peak of its florui at this time, this blossoming. And then there have been a lot of, all this privilege that people have been given, then they were taken back, and the Jewish population had to start up again. One of the good issues in the history of Alexandria was the Edict of Caracalla. In 212, all the citizens of the Roman Empire who were born free men, that meaning they were not slaves, not all the women, they became Roman citizens. This edict aimed to homogenize the population, which was revolting in bits and pieces, and try to give them a feeling that they were part of the same world. It did so to some extent, and it did not to some other extent. The rise of Christianity complicated the issues further, because when the Christians started becoming more and more, up to the point of becoming eventually the official religion of the Roman Empire, they had to define themselves with respect not only to their Jewish part, because Christianity, after all, was a sect that was part of the Jewish religion. They also had to define themselves and their religious identity vis-a-vis the pagans, the Greeks and the Romans and the polytheists of their times that they called Gentiles or Pagani, meaning the people who worship idols. And they also had to define, as we will see, themselves against the heretics. So for this sense, from this point of view, the 4th century is of massive importance for the construction of religious identities and for the shape that interreligious dialogue took in late antiquity, in the proto-Byzantine, like before the Byzantine times, around the times between Constantine and Theodosius II. So it was a period where Christianity had to define itself across 3 different fronts, and often these 3 different fronts and these 3 different populations, all of them residing in Alexandria, were coming into conflict, and they were coming into massive disagreements and also violent disagreements. There have been emperors who have been supporting the Jews. So for example, we know that Julian had promised to build up the temple for the Jews that has been destroyed by the Romans in the 70s. But Julian, the Emperor Julian, died. We do not know what would have been the fate of the Roman Empire or of Christianity altogether had Julian, who has been born Christian, then switched to become a pagan, and who was supporting the Jewish people more than his predecessor. What the fate of Christianity would have been had Julian remained on power for another decade or so. We will never know, of course. There have been also other massive events that probably shaped or pushed people to think a bit more religiously under the circumstances. There was a massive earthquake across the Eastern Mediterranean with massive destruction in 365. And then in 395, there was the death of Theodosius I, when the empire was divided in 2 parts. And then there was the eastern part, which was ruled by his one son, Arcadius, and the west part, which was ruled by his other son, Honorius. The future of the western part of the empire, like in 410, was not happy either. That was the sack of Rome by the Vandals, by Alaric, which created a massive commotion across, it reverberated across the empire because Rome, the holy city, was sacked. And this is how we arrive to, this is of course a very brief timeline with selected bits and main events put on it. This is how we arrive at the rise of 414, 415 in Alexandria, which are the peak of intercommunal violence and which resulted to the expulsion of the Jewish population from there, and also to the burning of the Greek and Roman temples in the city, a massive destruction, and probably also the destruction of the Serapeum and the whatever remaining pagan libraries were around. I have put here some notes for where my sources are and when I took these ideas from, just to give some scientific backing to what I'm saying, or for people who want to do some further reading. The PowerPoint will be up, I'm sure, later. So having made a sketch, a very brief sketch of what Alexandria might have looked like in the 4th century, that is a big city with export of, connections to the Silk Road and to the Spice Road, and also an intellectual hub where people were trained in the same spaces, cultural spaces, like in auditoria, amphitheaters, or outside in the Agora. One has to think what were people discussing about? We are aware that throughout antiquity, one genre that, Christian antiquity, that is like early Christian antiquity, one genre that really flourished was that of the genre contra Judaeos. When Christianity came up, it had to define itself against its Jewish past, against the Old Testament, and against all the other Jews who were not Christians. So there has been a lot of literature on exactly on why the Jewish people have understood it wrong, and we Christians, we have got it correct. There's also another genre that has been extremely popular, and we know it that came down from Plato, the genre of dialogue. we have the dialogue of Timothy and Aquila. The one of them was Christian, the other one was Jew. The dialogue of Trypho with Justin the Martyr, again the dialogue with the Jew. We have a treatise by Origen. By Origen in the 3rd century against Celsus that features a Platonic philosopher, Celsus, and also a Jewish, probably Hellenized from Alexandria interlocutor. So the Christian writer of the dialogue has to defend himself both against Celsus, the philosopher, who is sponsoring the pagan rites and the pagan way of thought, but also to defend himself against the Jewish beliefs of why Christians are doing things differently. This kind of milieu of dialogues and of treatises against someone, of course, created different personalities, and some of them were extremely difficult personalities. In the bottom picture here, you see Arius. Most of you might have heard about Arius being the first heretic of the church, or at least the first big villain and heretic of the church. In fact, Arius was a specimen of his own times to some extent. He was a bishop in the port section of Alexandria. He was living in the outskirts. He was not part of the bishopry of the sea in the midst of the city. The people who were listening to him were not the elite that was listening to Cyril, to Athanasius, who was in the city center. But Arius was also trained in philosophy. So part of his idea that the Christ in the Trinity should not be equal or co-equal or co-eternal to the Father, but subordinate to him, comes exactly from the kind of Platonic philosophies which were around in the air at this time. So in Platonic philosophy, you would also have a God who has 3 different qualities or 3 different manifestations, but among these 3 different manifestations, only one would have been the monos, the one, the mighty, and everything else would have been subordinate to him. So this was how Arius constructed his own philosophy. Of course, it did not work out because Christianity wanted the triad to be co-eternal, coexisting, and equal the one with the other. This is the famous Homoousian debate. But it does show that such kind of heresies also sprang from an environment where philosophy, religion, and different people from different backgrounds were often coming into contact. Another famous personality, and I have put here also a fictional portrait because we do not know how she looked, was the famous philosopher Hypatia. Maybe some of you have heard of her. She was the daughter also of a philosopher, of a mathematician. She was an astronomer and a woman of rare beauty, a virgin apparently, who was teaching both Christians and pagans. She was not a hardcore Platonist, so she did not, although she believed that Platonic philosophy is a kind of religion, she was also accepting people from other religious backgrounds to be taught with her. And her most famous student, of course, is Senecio of Cyrene, who was a pagan, later converted into Christianity, and he even became a bishop in Cyrene in Libya. So the events that describe what happened next is that although there was a background of debates, of exchange, and of a way of, instead of being able to understand people each other better, the rise of Christianity, when it became the official religion, especially after Theodosius I in 395, made the tensions between Christians and everybody who was not Christian extremely difficult. And the reaction of both Christians and their opponents was extremely harsh. So I have brought some texts, as I said in the beginning, that show the receptions of various religious ideas into the early Christian writings. So this is a part from the evangelic preparations. This is a treatise that Eusebius wrote of how you should prepare yourself before starting reading the Gospels. And where he says a couple of good words about Philo. He's one of the few. Eusebius was a student of Eusebius had the chance to be able to read the Philo, probably in the original at some point, although we do not know what the transmission of his text was. Precisely because Origen, who left Alexandria, took his cross of Philo with him when he moved to Cappadocia, to Caesarea Maritima, and then he continued teaching there, where Eusebius later had access to his own library. That is the story of books. I mean, Alexandria's life is related to books. So Eusebius here says, he's trying to explain why he's explaining the Bible with a specific way. And he says, but so that you may not judge me to interpret this text deceptively, I shall present for you as an interpreter of the thought contained in the scriptures a Hebrew man, who accurately described the things of his household from his fathers and learned the teachings of the schools. Philo, if you would have held, if you will have him. Listen then to how he interprets the divine discourses. What Eusebius here says is that my interpretation of the Old Testament is not just based on my own knowledge, but I'm also basing my knowledge on Philo. Because one of the main critics of the Jews against the Christian when interpreting the Old Testament and the scripture in general was, since you cannot do Hebrew, how can you interpret anything of that stuff which has already been translated into another language, which probably does not accurately describe what has been there in the original Hebrew? So Eusebius here shows a kind of continuation, and he brings in Philo in order to support his own argument. And in this respect, he does so not only by bringing Philo as a kind of Jewish scholar, but generally as a kind of talented interpreter and intellectual. Now, of course, this was a very positive way of presenting Hellenistic Jewish scholarship to late antique audiences. And here there is another text that comes from the letter of Synesius, the student of Hypatia, to his brother. Synesius was trying to travel from Alexandria to Cyrene when he got on a boat which was half already broken down. And then they were caught in a storm, then they were shipwrecked, they had to suffer a lot before being rescued and continue and arrive safely somewhere. What is interesting though is to show that in everyday life in Alexandria, all these people from all these different religious backgrounds somehow coexist. Here my story, he writes in his letter, his famous letter 4 to his brother, Synesius, that you may have no further leisure for your mocking wit. And I will tell you first of all how our crew was made up. Our skipper was a feign of death, owing to his bankrupt condition. Then besides him, we had 12 sailors, 13 in all. That is not enough. More than half of them, including the skipper, were Jews, a graceless race, and fully convinced of the piety of sending to Hades as many Greeks as possible. The remainder were a collection of peasants who, even as late as last year, had never gripped an oar. To people who are at sea, of course, and this is when the storm begins, in such crisis, life may be said to hang by a thread only. For if our skipper proved at such moment to be an orthodox observer of the Mosaic law, what was life worth in the future? So here he describes how the skipper happened to be a Jew, and the moment the Sabbath started, he stopped steering the ship. Indeed, we soon understood why he had abandoned the helm. For when we begged him to do this, to do his best to save the ship, he steadily continued reading his scroll. Of course, at some point, even the skipper has to take up the helm and steer the boat to some kind of coast where they're landing there shipwrecked without water, without anything for some time. But when, he continues, when now we touch the dearly beloved land, we embrace the earth as a real living mother. We send up hymns of gratitude to Providence, as is our custom. What is fascinating in this letter of Synesius, which is also peppered with lots of allusions to the Odyssey and Odysseus, and he does present his shipwreck also in way like with lines from the Odyssey, after all, is that he's trying to present himself as a kind of Greco-Roman elite. I mean, in the end, he doesn't say, I prayed to God for my salvation, but we thanked Providence. And this is a communal way of thanking the Providence altogether, whatever that Providence meant for each of the people who were on board. So there were Jews, there were Greeks, there were also people from abroad, as he says, there was a woman from Persia and other people. And of course, that does not mean that all this letter does not come with a bit of anti-Jewish sentiment. I mean, he starts by saying that we were convinced that the Jews are going to send us to Hades. That's again, though, a very Greek way of presenting things. It's a very vivid letter that shows how all these communities try to relate with each other, try to work out the situation. Of course, not always tolerated each other, but could potentially tolerate one another to a great degree, although the situation was not always as smooth as that. In Socrates, scholastic he was a Byzantine scholar writing in Constantinople, like sometime after the end of the 5th century. He wrote an ecclesiastical history. And he also describes some of the most violent events taking place in Alexandria during the episcopate of Cyril of Alexandria. Cyril was a very strong man with very strong beliefs. He also lived a long life, and he managed to make lots of friends and even more enemies among the Jews and among the pagans and even among the Christians. He was extremely upbeat to fight heresy. He inherited from his mentor Athanasius all this wish to fight against the Arians, and he was also in several political events in his own city. So this person Orestes here was actually the local governor of the city, with whom Cyril was not in good terms. Actually, we do not know whether he was in good terms with many people, but of course, Socrates being a Christian, and this is of course the history which is written by the Christian perspective when Christianity was a solid religion and of the Roman Empire, is of course biased and through a specific Christian lens. But let's read how bad things could get between the various communities in Alexandria. Now Orestes, the governor that is, had long regarded with jealousy the growing power of the bishops, because they encroached on the jurisdiction of the authorities appointed by the emperor, especially as Cyril wished to set spies over his proceedings. He therefore ordered a certain man Hierax to be seized, who was a henchman for Cyril, and publicly subjected him to the torture in the theater. Cyril, on being informed of this, sent for the principal Jews and threatened them with the utmost severities unless they ceases from their molestation of the Christians. The Jewish population, hearing these menaces, instead of suppressing their violence, only became more furious and were led from conspiracies for the destruction of the Christians. One of these was so desperate a character as to cause their entire expulsion from Alexandria. The violence between the Christians and Jews at this time under Cyril exploded so much that eventually, after 415, there were no more Jews remaining in Alexandria for a long, long time. But Cyril's rage and his manipulative way of putting people and mobs into, turn them into fanatics from both sides, was not only aimed against the Jews, it was also aimed against the pagans. And here's where Hypatia comes into the picture. So 2 chapters later, he discusses the fate of Hypatia. There was a woman at Alexandria named Hypatia, he says, daughter of the philosopher Theon, who made such attainments in literature and science as to far surpass all the philosophers of her own time. Having succeeded to the school of Plato and Plotinus, she explained the principles of philosophy to her auditors, many of whom came from the distance to receive her instructions. On account of the self-possession and ease of manner which she had acquired in consequence of the cultivation of her mind, she not unfrequently appeared in public in presence of the magistrates. Neither did she feel abashed in coming to an assembly of men. For all men, on account of her extraordinary dignity and virtue, admired her the more. Yet even she fell a victim to the political jealousy which at that time prevailed. For as she had frequent interviews with Orestes, that is the governor, it was calumniously reported among the Christian populace that it was she who prevented Orestes from being reconciled to the bishop. Some of them therefore, hurried away by a fierce and bigoted zeal, whose ringleader was a reader named Peter, waylaid her returning home and dragging her from the carriage. They took her to the church called Serapeum, where they completely stripped her and then murdered her with tiles. They stoned her to death. These events are also like the violent suppression of the Jewish and Christian riots in 415, 414, as well as the murder of Hypatia later, are exactly the climate of the early 5th century Alexandria. After that, the temples of the pagan divinities, of the pagan gods, were actually destroyed, most of them. They tried to save as many books as possible. Most of the libraries were burned down by Christian mobs, and the Jews were expelled from the city. That does not mean, of course, that they were expelled once and for all, or that there was not some kind of recovery. But after that, the empire was fully Christian. So as they moved from 414, 415, when this event took place, to the Arab conquest in 642, Alexandria was by that a fully Christian city. And the pagans remaining, and also the Jews, they had actually to convert in order to survive. This was the only way of staying in the city. Some of the Jews, though, managed to move upstream, up the Nile, further away in Antinopolis. And I have brought here as a last evidence from all this tumultuous life of this very big city, a papyrus. This is a bilingual marriage contract in Aramaic Greek between a groom called Samuel, who is from the Holy Land, from Palestine, and Metra, the daughter of a certain Eleazar from Alexandria, residing in Antinopolis. This papyrus is found now in Cologne. It's called the Ketubah of Cologne, Papyrus 553, and pretty much says how much the woman will bring in and how much she's supposed to, how much her dowry is when marrying her beloved someone. What is fascinating about this papyrus is that it's written in Aramaic letters, but it has also Greek words in it, which are transliterated in Aramaic. Jews from Alexandria were expected to be at least bilingual in Greek and Hebrew or Aramaic. But we also see here a kind of osmosis between cultures that people who were even expelled brought with them in the new places. I think this kind of ketubah is more or less an optimistic closing for interfaith dialogue in Alexandria. And before giving the floor to Alon, when I was presenting this, I was thinking to present all this material. It is striking how a city that was founded to promote exactly intercultural and religious debates and to provide a kind of syncretism or of osmosis across cultures, could even under also Christian legacy end up with having events big like this. Alexandria eventually, during the course of the 5th century, recovered, though not to the extent that it was before. What we know from the 5th century and 6th century Alexandria was that it was very famous for its Jewish doctors. But of course, nothing from its big shining light of the Hellenistic times or the 3rd century remained anymore there. And this is food for thought about how interfaith and in dialogue can be productive and to what kinds of obstacles it comes if it's not, if the political and the religious situation changes. Before giving to Alon the word and the floor, I have here a passage from Cyril. So Cyril, who was extremely harsh against the Jews, and in all his commentaries and treatises and speeches, he was really trying to depict them as the villains in the Christian story, in the Christian narrative, that they were not capable enough to recognize that they had the Messiah in front of them actually crucified. This is kind of recurring motif that we find across all church fathers. Nonetheless, he and other people could not entirely neglect the Jewish background of the religion. The more one of the, as possible as it can be for Cyril, positive ways of describing the faith of Israel is found in one of his commentary on the Genesis, and it reads thus: "At the end of time, our Lord Jesus Christ will be reconciled with Israel." He's talking about the second coming. His ancient persecutor, just as Jacob kissed Esau after his return from Haran. No one who listens to the words of the Holy Scripture can actually doubt that with the passing of the time, Israel also will have to be received again into the love of Christ through faith. one should not expect to find in any Christian church father of this time a very positive word about how the Jews will be part of the salvation. But this is as good as it gets. Of course, this also assumes that the Jews will become Christians and they will have to recognize their own misinterpretation of the Bible and the history as they saw it. But this was the time in the 5th century from the 4th to the 5th century Alexandria of this era. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Anna. It's time for a brief response from Alon. So, Alon, over to you. You'll have to unmute yourself. And
yes, thank you very much, Anna, for your excellent presentation. I learned a lot from it, and it covers so a huge span, a huge historical span. And so as far as interfaith dialogue and religious conflict, so you started with Alexander the Great, who tried to create a melting point, a melting pot in Alexandria, and then you ended with Cyril. So it's really wonderful. So the thing that what I think is that you know, so I have two parts in my personality. So one is very religious, which always directs me to read the texts by monks, the monks of the desert, and just to go to visit seminaries and to see all these things. So something very, very naive. But on the other hand, so there is always a political, and this is something which we cannot ignore, always a political considerations there. So starting with Alexander, so of course, so it's a great idea to make out of Alexandria a melting pot. But his consideration was a political consideration, of course, just to calm down the Persians, to create a Greek empire, etc. Then you also mentioned Paul address to the unknown God. So this is also, so it's there is a huge interpretation about it. Who was this unknown God? But people say that it was also a political matter. So there were lots of people who worshipped this unknown God, and Paul didn't want to mess up with them. So he didn't want to have any argue with them. So he wanted to recruit them as well. And I'm just trying to think of other examples. The Caracalla example. This is something which is very beautiful, very important. But again, so also with him, so he was cynical. So he wanted more taxes from people.
More citizens, more taxes from Roman citizens.
Yes. And with the council of Nicaea and the removal of Arius, there is lots of politics involved in this story. So in this story, and also the revolt of the Jews, the removal or the creation of new Rome. This is also 4th century in Constantinople. So you know, so we can't. So it's very beautiful and all these ideas, but something always spoils the party, and this is these political considerations. And we saw it also in the last quote which you brought, or one of the last quotes which you brought by Socrates. You see there. So so the Jews threatened the authority of the bishops. Yes, so maybe. Yes.
It was not the Jews. It was the bishop was afraid of the Christians.
Yes.
Of the governor was afraid of the Christian bishops because they were gradually gaining the favors of the populace, and they were becoming popsters in principle. So a bishop was more mighty than the governor Orestes.
Yes.
There is an amazing political component. There is also a religious component to all that stuff. That Greek religion and Egyptian religion before that, they're not exclusivist religions. So you can believe in Isis and Isis, but you don't have to renunciate to Isis if you want to believe on Isis, or to Demeter, or to Pluto, or to Athena, or to Minerva. So there was a kind of plurality in the religious palette of the early Roman Empire, that is the first 3 centuries, from the 1st to the 3rd century, that did not exist after with the rise of Christianity in power. And this was the point that I wanted actually to bring in this debate, not much from the political, but also from the way of cultural. Of course, with Arius, it was a political thing, and Arianism did not disappear after the Council of Nicaea. Arianism continued to exist. We had several Arian bishops after Constantine. We had several Gothic Arians in the West, and the tradition just continued way well into the Middle Ages. To some extent, it was not just a heresis about being heretic as opposed to being Orthodox, whatever that meant at the beginning of Christianity, but it was some kind of religious opposition to the ruling Roman Empire of the East, who was Chalcedonian, or who was Nicaean, or who was something else. So one can read Arianism from the priest, especially Arianism in the Latin West and in the North Africa, as a way of contradicting exactly the big dominant party, which was the Orthodox or Chalcedonian East. What I wanted to bring into this presentation is that although there were so many opportunities and at different time frames, there was the opportunities and the dialogue happened. In so many other cases, dialogue never happened, and went actually very, very bad, as also with Cyril. And I was wondering when I was preparing, what made the dialogue possible under these circumstances or under the other circumstances? And the answers I could get down to is that probably the political handling of religion changed. So for Alexander, it was not important which kind of divinity they're going to worship. The same was about, like Caracalla, you said, I do not care what you worship, but I want more taxes. You can all be Romans. You can feel a Roman, whatever that meant. And so this kind of freedoms gave way of a rise of people's religious backgrounds. They felt confident into believing, they felt confident into communicating to other people. People like Philo felt welcome, presumably, into the circles of his fellow pagan Platonists. And it is why this environment could not just continue with the establishment of Christianity in the early 5th century, or what went wrong. It was also not possible to do that in Constantinople, so in the capital of the Roman Empire. It would have been less possible as in Alexandria. So in Alexandria, you would have Arius with his philosophical background, also with the Jewish support, because Arius also evoked Jewish support to revolt against Athanasius. You also had Hypatia, who was friends with Christians and with pagan allies. This would not have been possible, for instance, in Constantinople. And in the 4th and 5th century, it would also not have been possible in Athens, which was a very pagan, philosophically minded, closed society by that time. So the dialogue I wanted to bring up by bringing texts from massive, I mean, it's like 6 centuries across, is why dialogue sometimes is fostered and sometimes it goes so wrong.
Yes.
Thank you very much to you both. We have some time now for questions from our audience. And if you can find the button for raising your hand up under reactions at the bottom of the screen. If not, let me try and see as many of you as possible. Just raise your hand. Or write your question, or just write that you would like to ask a question in the chat box. No questions?
Yeah.
Caroline, please.
Hello. Thank you so much for the lovely talk. Can I ask about origin? And obviously the powers that be rejected Origenism in a massive expulsion of the monks from the desert in 400, and Theophilus, and later Origen became, not allowed. Was that a sort of intellectual versus a non-intellectual? Was it a sort of ordinary lay dispute from intellectual dispute? And would that have had a kind of counterpart between Christians and Jewish people? I mean, would the Jewish people would be a very intellectual debate, wouldn't it? And I just wondered if there was a bit of intellectualism versus the real people kind of debate to it.
I'm inviting also Alon to contribute if he feels like. I do not know, Alon, whether you have strong views about Origen. The issue with Origen was that he was considered a heretic. He was thought that in his writing he had influences from Gnostic writings. Some of these Gnostic writings were of Jewish origin, some of them we do not know. But when Origen wrote, Christianity was not the religion of the empire. He was still writing in a very fluid time of early Christian writings where, like Clement before him, he had to define himself across different spectrums. So the condemnation of Origen's writings comes from a tendency of Christianity to find itself. Of course, later, for instance, Athanasius wrote the life of the monks, like the life of Anthony, where he is exactly praising as the prototype, the model, like the non-educated, the non-intellectual Christian. But that does not mean that the life of Athanasius is not written in beautiful Greek by somebody who had studied very well, although he says Athanasius was great precisely because he didn't go to school at some point. It also does not mean that the writings of Origen were not read. And there was a kind of mysticism in the writings of Origen, and some things, of course, that people later after Nicaea did not agree with him whatsoever. I mean, he came from a different century after all. I mean, he was 1 century before that. But there were certain ideas that they were reproduced, and even if not stated by name, like we saw, like in the passage from Eusebius, he was still influential for the later thinkers. So I don't think that Origen just disappeared. It's just they were not allowed to talk loudly about him. I don't know what Alon believes.
Well, there's another question from Sharif. If you could kindly unmute yourself, Sharif, and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. I have a small question concerning the turning point from plurality and having this multitude of religions in the 4th century to the change in the 5th century, which not only was in Alexandria, but went also across the whole country, even 500 kilometers to the south of Alexandria. We see that the monks under the leadership of Shenouda the Archimandrite are also attacking pagans in the 5th century and destroying temples and things like that, which resulted in a lot. So would you say, what was really the reason of this turnaround starting at the turn of the century? Was it the 395 ediction that Christianity now is the official religion and that bishops started to have, or religion started to be the religion of the state, or what's exactly? Because the change is very stark between the 3rd and the 4th century across the whole country, not only in Alexandria.
It is a general change of beliefs and a much more fanatic approach to religion in the 4th century. It's witnessed not only with Christians, but also with the pagans. I mean, pagan, like Greeks and Romans, they always practiced the Platonic philosophy. But at some point in the 4th century, they started believing that Plato was a god, or some kind of a saint, or that Pythagoras was some kind of a saint. And this feeling of like this wish to find like some kind of deeper meaning in the philosophy also intensified in the course of the 4th century. So for the violence that erupted, it was because they were protected by law. They were protected by several edicts, especially from Theodosius I, that allowed and even subconsciously encouraged. There were no penalties against them if they destroyed the temples. This kind of law then decreased in the aftermath with Arcadius and then afterwards. And for instance, with an emperor like Julian, there were more freedoms given and more religious freedom, like there was more support. You could find your right if you were going somewhere to the court. But it was the law that allowed them to have impunity.
There's another question from Adesoji Adesina. You can ask it yourself, Adesoji, if you unmute yourself.
Okay. Yeah, basically what I wanted to know is whether what the situation, whether you have any comment on the struggle within the church itself, for example, the debate on Arianism between Athanasius and Arius, and how that impacted the interfaith dialogue that Christians were also having at the same time with Judaism or with other pagan religions.
Interesting point about this thing is that Arius was supposed to side with the Jews. So they thought that they were common enemies. So at some point when Arius was coming against Athanasius, he was backed by Jews. Or there was different Judaizing Christians, which were also posing a problem for the real Christians, for whoever believed that they were real Christians. There was not an Orthodox, there was Christianity in the making, so you cannot really say this was Orthodox, this was heretic, because it was a way of fixing the creed, which was not fixed, and which took up to the 7th century to fix it down, to pin it down the way we know it now. So there was a way of trying to define themselves across different ways. So one of the problems was, for instance, Judaizing Christians, who said that the way we are practicing is far away from the real religion we should have been having, because we should look back and practice our rituals to the way the Jews are practicing them. So the non-Judaizing Christians, like of the kind of Athanasius and Cyril, they had issues also with this kind of people too. So to some extent, they had several fronts but this did not make them milder towards the end or the other. They just had to decide which is the best or the least evil, whether with the pagans, whether with the Jews, or whether the heretics. And I think the heretics was the most, this was the most traumatic experience of the church, because they did not anticipate it. It was something that had not come up with the Greek and Roman religion, though you could not be heretic if you believe in Isis, Mithras, and Zeus simultaneously, if you are allowed to do that. So this was a new debate for them and a new way of thinking about religion, which just started in the 4th century and continued all the way up to the 7th century. So they had several fronts from which they were trying to define themselves from and against. But it's not that they were siding with one. So they did find, for instance, that pagan philosophy is helping them to defend themselves against Arianism. And the way they were trying to define the creed in Chalcedon in 451, it was exactly by using even more philosophy to define what should have been, how the Trinity is defined, and how to maintain the mysticism within the interpretation of the Trinity. So they did find some tools in the debates with the Christians, which they used to define their own creed, but this did not make them milder against the enemies, or what they thought they were the enemies.
There's, perhaps before we break, another short question from Christoph.
Thank you. Yes, just a brief comment about Alon's comment, or a comment and a question about the relationship between politics and religion. You probably agree, Alon, that regarding the question of politics and religion, that it's kind of both ways already in the 1st century. So on the one hand, of course, politics does instrumentalize religion, and later on even more so. But then you can also clearly see that religion and religious paradigm change shape and transform politics. So we have new political models that emerge. For instance, we don't have time to discuss in detail, but the way the relationship between the universal and the particular is thought of, also with respect to politics, changes. And that the Christian tradition has something uniquely to contribute. Maybe they never, in the 1st century, never fully explored the full potential of these paradigm changes, but there is certainly a paradigm change taking place, which also has repercussions for the interreligious dialogue. So the understanding of interreligious dialogue changes. Yeah, would you agree with that? You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I think so. Oh, thanks, Chris, for this interesting question. So there has been a debate, so a huge debate between philosopher and law expert Carl Schmitt, also very Catholic, and Eric Peterson, a Catholic expert. So the debate was whether politics is a sort of religion, or whether religion is a sort of politics, So it's so I don't want to. So this is I'm going to talk about that in my part. So after the break, so I don't want to make too big a spoiler now. But so yeah, so it's there is a mutuality between both, and so you always see, unfortunately. So I don't want to see that, but I can't help. So I want to be naive and believe it, so but I can't help. So we always see these political considerations on the side. So with Arius, for example, many questions. So the question is why they excommunicated, or why they didn't admit Arius, and but they didn't have such a huge trouble with the Jews, for example. So Arius was Christian. So and I've been reading a little bit about this debate, and so I didn't want to see that, but there's still lots of political considerations there. So why the Jews and why the Jews are okay, or are okay, and Arius not, and then why the pagans are bad and the Jews not? Why and later, so with the birth of Islam, so why the Jews are okay and the Muslims are not? So there are lots of political considerations there, and so it's a very hard to draw the line between where religion ends and politics starts, and vice versa.
If I can add one point to that, is that previously in the Roman Empire, the one responsible for, the only religion that somebody had to observe was the cult of the emperor. I mean, you had to worship your emperor, you had to offer your sacrifices to the emperor on whatever birthday, whatever it was, the day of the emperor. You had to honor that because you were a Roman citizen. Now, in Rome, there was also the Pontifex Maximus, who was responsible about the rituals, about the rites. So there was a separation between not total separation, but to some kind of degree of separation between the political and the military power and the religious power. And what I said before was, like, monotheistic religions tend to be exclusivist. And the fight with Arius and with heresies at the beginning of the church, a way of defining the church across different opponents, is based on this exclusivist way that we believe in one God. It's finished. From the moment that the Christians said we believe in one God, and Paul said we believe in one God. Although when he said that on the Pnika, he's quoting from Aratus, who was a Stoic and a poet, a Greek poet. When he says that, ultimately it brings people in front of an ultimatum. You have to choose which God, which was never necessarily the case in the Roman Empire. There have been emperors who favored the sun god, like Elagabalus. There have been other emperors who favored Isis. There have been different trends. But never has it been so strict, and never the Roman people had, because we should assume that these early Christians were Romans. Like Synesius' letter shows that he was a Roman. I mean, he goes to pray to the Providence because he was saved at the end, or he quotes and cites lines from the Odyssey within his letter. For these people who were Roman, they never had to come across such a dilemma before. So if we say that we believe in this one God, and all the difficulties would come with confessing the triad in the early church, what do we actually believe? And this is where the purge starts. And the purge starts across anything that is not helpful to define what people believe. And the 3rd and the 4th and the 5th century, they were extremely fluid times. I mean, Nicaea did not solve issues. They actually said that this is the situation now, that the son is co-equal with the father, but then how is he co-equal? And what is his mother doing in this kind of equation? And then the kind of question only created more questions to be solved in the next councils, going all the way down to the iconoclasm, more or less. So it's a big debate. It's just to try to see how an environment that can promote dialogue can also create, under specific religious and political situations, religious violence.
Thank you so much. Very thought-provoking. I think it's time now for us all to have a short break, let's say about 10 minutes. It's 40 minutes past. So if we meet here at 50 minutes past, or 10 to, in 10 minutes time, that would be great. So I urge you to have a lovely cup of tea or a coffee. It will go very well with the presentation.